so our next speaker is David Kastner. He's going to talk about individual animals use distinct strategies in a changing spatial memory task.
Okay, I'd like to thank the organizers for giving the opportunity to present my work. So in studying animal behavior, it's common to focus exclusively on the performance of groups of animals. However, it's often the case that you can use different strategies to solve a given task. And as we actually just saw in the previous talk, it's quite reasonable to think that the brain is representing those strategies that are being used as much as just the absolute performance. This disconnect is really acutely felt when studying animal disorders in animal models of disease and trying to understand the connection between genomic level changes and animal behavior. Fragile X syndrome and FMR1 provide a very useful example. So Fragile X syndrome is a cause of intellectual disability across multiple domains. It's a monogenetic cause of autism, and it's due to the silencing of the FMR1 gene. There's been a knockout mouse for over 20 years, and that mouse shows numerous cellular and circuit level deficits. However, and this quote really sums it up nicely, surprisingly, cognitive deficits in FMR1 mice have proven remarkably mild and somewhat inconsistent across publications. The motivating hypothesis for this talk and my work has been that the seemingly mild phenotype and inconsistent phenotype is due to the lack of accounting for individual variability and accounting for different strategies that can be used. Therefore, using an FMR1 knockout rat, we wanted to find a behavior that would support individual variability, allowing us to measure it and account for it, to therefore look at strategies, also one that was cognitively challenging, and also for future studies will allow a connection to neurophysiology. We used a spatial alternation task for our behavior, where we had a 6-arm track. At the end of each of the arms is a reward well, and prior to the animals learning the task, they get to explore the track in a pre-training period where they get rewarded at any well that they visit. Once the task begins, 3 of the arms have the potential to be rewarded, and to get reward, the animal has to alternate between the outer arms. For example, a rewarded sequence would be the animal going from arm 2 to arm 3, where it's rewarded. Since it was previously at arm 2, it has to go to arm 4 to get a reward. It then returns to arm 3, and since it was previously at arm 4, it has to go to arm 2 to get rewarded. So this was the first contingency of the task that we did, and the animals do this for 5 days. All of the animals are able to learn the task. Where I'm showing here is the smooth reward probability across all 30 animals. And what you can see is at the beginning of the task, they don't get many rewards, and then over time, they learn how to get rewards. We then switch the strategy where we switch the 3 rewarded arms, and the animals do the same thing. They have a hard time initially, then do better. We switch the contingency again. Again, same thing happens, and then for the last contingency, which is the hardest one, the animals actually have to skip arms and continue to alternate. Within this group of 30 rats, 20 of them are control animals, and 10 of them were Fragile X. And as you can see, both groups of animals actually span the same range of variability as each other. And if we look at the average performance, really consistent with that quote, we really don't see any difference in the performance of these 2 groups of animals. So we now have a task where we were able to measure the variability of these animals. We next wanted a way to be able to account for that variability, so we'd be able to look at animals that are performing the test similarly and then compare what the genotype might be doing. To do that, we developed a working memory reinforcement learning model to capture the behavior. The real challenge in developing the model was getting the model to learn as fast as the animals, since ultimately the animals actually do this task very well. I won't be able to tell you much more about the structure of the model, but I hope you can see that ultimately we have a model that can learn just as fast as the animals. What the model does is it outputs a sequence of well visits, and there are 3 parameters that control the learning of the model to fit the animals. So we fit this model to all 30 animals, so we get these 3 parameters, and we can look at the space for all 30 animals of these 3 parameters. So we have a 3-dimensional space that I'm just for visualization purpose projecting down onto all pairs of parameters. And so what I first hope you can see is that this model is also displaying quite a bit of variability, reflecting the variability that we saw in the behavior. And the next thing that I hope you can appreciate is there's this tight group of animals down in the corner there, where actually 40% of the animals are there on this side, just to represent it there. 12 of the 30 animals live in that little corner with high learning rates and low temporal discounting. Using various clustering algorithms, we can actually pull out that as a distinct cluster. And what this allowed us to do was now look at the behavior of that group of animals relative to the rest of the animals. And when we do that, we can see that this group of animals is actually performing the task the best. These are the animals that are doing the best in the performance. We can most easily see that by just taking the difference between these two average performance curves. And at the switch of each contingency, the group of animals is doing 10 to 20% better than the remaining animals. Because of that, going forward, I'm going to call this group of animals the high-performing animals and the remaining animals the low-performing animals. And to really, for going forward, by coloring the dots by whether or not the animals were control or Fragile X, you can see that in this tight group over here, we have both control animals and Fragile X. So both of these animals are able to perform the task as well as any other. So now focusing in on that group, we can look at the average behavior of the 7 control animals and the 5 Fragile X animals in this group. And as would be expected based on the model fit, they perform very similarly. There are actually some slight differences in the performance that are interesting, and I'm happy to talk about offline or during the question period. But the thing that this really raises is Fragile X syndrome is a pretty substantial cognitive deficit in humans. How is it possible that these animals, the Fragile X animals, are doing so well? And so hopefully you now know the answer is they perform different strategies. And so this is a task that there are really at least two different strategies that enable correct performance of the task. The first one is the one that I described when telling you about the task initially, and that's an alternation from center. So for example, if the animal is currently at arm 3 and was previously at arm 4, it has to remember that it was at arm 4 and then go to the opposite side to arm 2 and then return back to arm 3. A different strategy for the task is a directional sweep. We're here as an example. If the animal is currently at arm 4 and was previously at arm 3, what it does is just turns around and sweeps 2 arms over in the other direction, where it then turns around and goes in the opposite direction. What distinguishes these two strategies is the location of the hardest part of the task. For the alternation from center, it's that center arm that's the hardest part of the task. That's where the animal has to remember where it was previously and go to the opposite side. For the directional sweep, it's the outer arms that are the harder one. That's where the animal has to turn around and go in the opposite direction. So under the assumption that this hardest part of the task actually takes longer, what we would predict is that for an animal doing the alternation from center strategy, it would be the trials beginning at the center, the outbound trials, that would take relatively longer than the inbound trials. And that's exactly the case for the high-performing control animals, where what I'm showing here is the relative timing that it takes for the outbound trials compared to the inbound trials. What you can see is that these high-performing animals spend more time on their outbound trials. That's, however, not the case for these high-performing Fragile X animals, where they actually spend relatively more time on the inbound trials compared to the outbound trials, consistent with the directional sweep, where again, that inbound trial is the one where the animal would turn around and have to go in the opposite direction and change its pattern of behavior. This difference is not the case in the low-performing animals, where we don't see any difference in the relative timing between the control and the Fragile X animals. So these data are consistent with the wild-type animals performing the alternation from center strategy, and the Fragile X in the high-performing group performing the directional sweep. If we think more about these strategies, the alternation from center is really more of a memory-guided, cognitive-based task, where the directional sweep is a more motor-based, habitual-type task, which might suggest that the directional sweep can actually take shorter, be a quicker type of task than the alternation from center, a quicker type of strategy than the alternation from center. So we next looked at the time that it took these animals to perform this task. And so what I'm plotting here for both the high performers and the low performers is the average trial time within each session over all the sessions. What I hope you can see is that in the high-performing group, the Fragile X animals have consistently shorter trial lengths. They significantly go faster to perform this task than the high-performing control animals, where we don't see any difference in the time to perform the task in the low-performing group. So to understand this difference in the high-performing group, we next looked at the average reward probability that the animals get for a given trial length. And what you can see is that the Fragile X animals actually shift their curve to the left relative to the wild type, which means that they get more rewards on shorter trials, which suggests potentially that the Fragile X animals actually go faster to do the task as well as they do, to get more rewards. To understand this a little better, let me remind you that there's a pre-training period where the animals actually get rewarded at any arm that they visit. And so we can look at the average trial length distribution during that exploratory period compared to the alternation task. And what you can see for these high-performing control animals, the distributions are actually quite similar. The speed they do for the pre-training period is very similar to the speed they're using for the alternation task. That's not the case, however, for the high-performing Fragile X animals, where they actually shift their curve to the left. When they do the alternation task, they're going faster than they would if there were really no constraints on their behavior. Again, suggestive that with the idea that these Fragile X animals might have to go faster to do this task, which suggests the possibility that the Fragile X animals actually have a worse memory, and they're compensating for that worse memory by going faster on this task. Of course, further experiments really have to further explore that possibility. So in conclusion, I've shown you that Fragile X rats show the same range and variability as control rats. By modeling the individual animal's behavior, we were able to compactly describe it, which allowed us to account for that individual variability. And once we did that, by looking at animals that perform the task very similarly, we were able to see that the Fragile X animals use a distinct strategy to perform this task, and one that might be compensatory for the deficits that really underlie the disability. With that, I'd like to acknowledge Loren Frank and the whole Frank lab. Peter Dayan, I worked with Peter Dayan to develop the model, and Anna Gillespie and I collected all the data and really developed a lot of these ideas together. And of course, the funding sources, and I'd like to thank you all for listening.
Yeah. Hi, really cool dissection of data. So I'm slightly puzzled by the logic of the ambition. People who've worked in reversal learning for a while, I sort of feel for 30 years struggled with the problem that animals they didn't know how animals were doing the task. They could be doing it with a one-step back memory or with value, et cetera, et cetera. And so it seems like modern times we're trying to make tasks that you can't solve in two ways so that we can get good comparisons and know that we're comparing like with like and not comparing apples with oranges. But it seems that you're advocating a task where multiple strategies are available, and I'm just interested to know why. Yeah.
Yeah, great question. So I think from where I'm coming from, it's maybe impossible to definitively say what the animals are doing, right? We can't ask them what they're thinking, what they know at any moment in time. So I actually assume that there are always different ways to do the task. We can try as hard as we want to really limit what they do, but I think ultimately the animals can find as many different strategies as they want, and we can try to limit that to as tight a range as possible, and there are definitely tasks that enable that. But I think we can lose some of the richness of the animal's abilities and potentially compensatory strategies by limiting it too far.
But are you going to need to find some control animals that perform the task in the same way as the Fragile X ones in order to get any sensible recording?
Yeah, and so yeah, absolutely. And in other experiments that I didn't have time to show, even the control animals will sometimes switch under certain circumstances to use the other strategy to allow us to kind of tease apart some of those limitations.
Hi, great talk. I think I got a little bit confused on the way you were distinguishing between these two strategies that the animals were using. And you seem to just be like kind of relying on duration, and I'm confused as to why you didn't like actually just look at the paths that the mice were taking, or whatever animal, sorry, I missed that. Whatever path they were taking, or like setting up a probability to go from one arm to the next and using that as a metric.
Yeah, great question. So first it's rats,
Okay,
but it's a rodent, they're all the same. The reason we focused on the timing difference is because ultimately when it comes down to it, these animals perform the task actually very, very well. And both strategies will do the same behavior. They go one direction, other direction, and what underlies it really seems to only come out in the timing differences. However, and this is where the slight difference that I mentioned in the performance come into play. So for the Fragile X animals, it seems to be they're doing that directional sweep. The directional sweep, the hardest part of the task is now the inbound trials. And one of the differences in the average performance is the Fragile X animals actually make more inbound errors. So you can see, in these smaller subsets how they make errors, again, consistent with the behavior. So there are additional things. I highlighted the one that I thought was kind of the most clear. But yeah, we do have other signatures that these strategies are in play.
Thank you.
Just following up from Tim, I'm still confused about what the relative benefits of different approaches would be. So it seemed like you started off assuming that all animals would use the same strategy, and you clustered in parameter space. And then you said, well, if they're similar in parameter space, how do I tease apart strategies? Why didn't you start off with different strategies in the first place? I mean, or design a task which would tease those apart?
Yeah, great question. Right, ultimately, the model was only so good, right? The model really, in the best case scenario, should have pulled apart these strategies. This is a model-independent model, so it has no capacity for strategy. That's something we're actually working on going forward. But I think even independent of that, the real critical thing here was be able to look at animals that were performing the tasks similarly. And the model gave us that. The model was able to compactly describe things enough so that we can find this tight group of animals that we then were able to expose the strategies with. Going forward now, we definitely are interested in incorporating that into the modeling, but we have to start somewhere, and this actually worked pretty well, fortunately.
Hello, thank you very much for the talk and to show that there is a beneficial part of having a task with multiple possible strategies. I'm just curious, since the two strategies has two different paths, have you recorded the path that each individual animal take and go back to see if that matches the prediction?
You mean the actual physical?
Yeah.
So the space is the same for both animals. Are you asking the timing it takes, or?
I thought in your schematic, the two strategy, the first strategy is turning in the center, and the second strategy is turning on the rightmost. And those two distinct paths seems to be the difference of the two strategies, if that's what I understood.
Yes, sorry for not being clear. I think, so ultimately, they do the same thing in the task. They both, go from arm, if it's 2, 3, and 4, they go 2, 3, 4, 4, 3, 2. It's, what the underlying cognitive load might be. In the alternate from center strategy, it's when they're at that center arm, arm 3, that they have to remember where they were previously and go to the opposite side. Whereas for the directional sweep, all it is, count over 2, turn around, count over 2, turn around, right? Go left, go right, go left, go right. They're still visiting the same arms, but the underlying strategy is what differentiates the two.
Thank you.
Right, let's thank the speaker again.